Chapter 2 will discuss how economic conditions affect businesses while taking into consideration and understanding free market capitalism, socialism, communism, the trend toward mixed economies, and understanding the U.S. economic system. The learning objectives in Chapter 2 are to explain basic economics, explain what capitalism is and how free markets work, compare socialism and communism, analyze the trend towards mixed economies, describe the economic system of the United States, and contrast fiscal policy and monetary policy, and explain how each one affects the economy. To give you an insight into the effects economies have on the success of businesses in the U.S. and across the globe, let's just talk about economic effects. A major part of the United States business success is due to an economic and social climate that allows most businesses to operate freely. People are free to start a business anywhere and just as free to fail and start again. That freedom motivates people to try until they succeed because the rewards are often really great. Any change in the U.S. economic or political system has an influence on a business success. For example, an increase or decrease in government regulations has an economic effect due to the costs of adhering to the regulations. Some experts believe that less regulation is better for business, and others believe the opposite. The optimal level of government regulation is a constant topic of debate. Global economics and global politics also have a major influence on businesses in the U.S. For example, the revenue of a major U.S. industrial company such as Caterpillar depends heavily on the global market, especially in China. This slide shows a great example of economic contrast. On the left side of the pictures is North Korea, which is a communist country, that it doesn't look like it's doing so well. But on the right-hand side is a picture of South Korea, where business is booming. As we continue in the chapter, think about what causes such dramatic differences to two countries that are so close geographically, but so far apart with the well-being and growth of the countries. Resource development is the study of how to increase resources and create conditions that will make better use of them. Businesses can contribute to an economic system by inventing products that greatly increase available resources. For example, they can discover new energy sources like natural gas for autos, new ways of growing food, and new ways of creating needed goods and services such as nanotechnology. New ways to producing goods and services adds resources to the economy and create more employment. So as you can see on the screen, fish farms create both food and jobs. Can you think of other innovations that might increase the economic development? Keep that in mind as we go through the chapter. Thomas Malthus believed that if people were left to their own devices, there would be chaos. Therefore, the government needed to be heavily involved in controlling the economy. Malthus's ideas are still with us in a term called neo-Malthusianism, which is an idea of overpopulations and are prevalent in books such as Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, which contains ideas similar to those presented by Thomas Malthus 200 years ago. Malthus viewed a large population as negative. However, many economists today see a highly educated population as being a valuable and scarce resource. Countries like Japan and Germany are great examples of nations that have become economically successful due to their large population of well-educated people producing sophisticated and high-value products. Adam Smith's ideas were laid out in his seminal book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations. Smith believed strongly in more natural liberty and less government intervention into the economy, an idea that was an anathema to Malthus. Smith argued that allowing people the freedom to own land and the right to keep profit would not create chaos, as Malthus had argued, but rather would create greater resources for all. What do you think? The invisible hand was the heart of Adam Smith's theory describing the process of turning self-directed gain into social economic benefits for all. Based on applying Adam Smith's theory on this slide, think about what might motivate you to start your own business. The economic system that has led to the wealth creation in much of the world is known as capitalism. Under capitalism, all or most of the factors of production and distribution, such as land, factories, railroads, and stores, are owned by individuals. They are operated for profit, and business people, not government officials, and decide what to produce and how much, what to charge, and how much to pay their workers. They also decide whether to produce goods in their own countries or have them made in other countries. State capitalism is a combination of freer markets and some government control. For example, China has had rapid growth as a result of state capitalism, freer markets and less government control, even though the country is controlled by the Communist Party. The four basic rights under a capitalist system are straightforward, but which of the four basic rights has been weakened in the United States over the last 30 years? Think about how eminent domain may have weakened the right to own property. On this slide, how Jessica Douglas purchased a building with plenty of room to grow and started her own business called Flowers and Weeds. She had the right to own private property and the right to own the business and keep its profits, which are all fundamental rights that exist in the economic system called free market capitalism. Think about if either of these rights would be viable without the other. To understand free market capitalism, we also must think about Roosevelt's 4 additional freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom to worship in your own way, and freedom from want or fear. A free market is one in which decisions about what and how to produce are made by the market, by the buyers and the sellers, negotiating prices for goods and services. So for you and I and the consumers send signals to tell producers what to make, how many, what color, and so on. Prices are determined by consumers negotiating with sellers of goods and services. By the buyers and the sellers negotiating in the marketplace, a seller may want to sell their church for $50, but maybe only a few people may buy it at that price. So since the demand at that price isn't there, the seller might lower the price and the quantity demanded from consumers might increase. In order to understand free market capitalism even more, you have to understand the supply, demand, and equilibrium point. Supply refers to the quantities of products manufacturers or owners are willing to sell at different prices at a specific time. Basically, the amount supplied will increase as the price increases because sellers can make more money with higher price. Demand refers to the quantity of products that people are willing to buy at different prices at different times. The quantity demanded will increase as the price decreases. Then moving on to the market price or equilibrium point, it's determined by supply and demand. It is the price toward which the market will trend. Although proponents of a free market argue that if supply and demand interactions determine prices, then there's no need for governments to set those prices for consumers. This slide shows the supply curve and how the amount of shirts increase and how it corresponds with price. So as you can see, the supply curve rises from left to right. The higher the price of t-shirt goes, the more sellers are willing to supply them because in the end, they're making more money. This slide shows the demand curve at various prices, which is, very similar to the way the supply curve was set up. So basically, this demand curve is showing the quantity of t-shirts demanded at different prices. The demand curve falls from left to right. The lower the price of t-shirts, the higher the quantity of demand from the consumer. Now, let's look at the equilibrium point. This shows where the quantity demanded and the quantity of supplied meet right in the middle where it says the equilibrium point. When we put both of the supply and demand curves on the same graph, we find that intersection that shows a price where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal. So in the long run, the market price will tend towards that equilibrium point, which is at about 25 t-shirts and at $15. So this is a great ethical decision-making slide regarding medicine that's provided to consumers. So in this situation, a pharmaceutical company acquired a drug called Reloform, a chemotherapy drug for liver cancer. In the company, they typically have committees, and this particular one is a finance committee that recommends increasing the price of the drug from $300 to $3,000 to help alleviate the development costs. The public reacted with rage, accusing the firm of favoring profits over the needs of patients. So the question is, as the person making the decision to increase the cost, would you follow the committee's recommendation and raise the price? And what would be the alternative to raising the price? And what might be the consequences of each? So I do work for a pharmaceutical-like company. We do a lot of testing. So we're the middleman between the pharmaceutical and the doctors that are providing the therapeutic drugs like Reloform. And the problem is when drug companies do all this background research in order to develop new drugs for treatments, there's billions sometimes spent on developing these drugs. So if higher prices aren't charged from that pharmaceutical company's perspective, then they're going to have a harder time trying to get people in to invest in potential new drugs, and so they can see a return on their investment. So that's from a pharmaceuticals side. But then from the consequence of increasing that cost, you do cause that reaction that's listed on the slide, that people that really, really need this drug can't afford to take it and could potentially die. So what's more important, making sure citizens of the country are actually getting what they need in order to survive liver cancer, or could the government potentially supplement this so they don't have to charge more, but yet the drug companies are still getting that return on investment? So just a few things to think about. Economists agree there are 4 different degrees of competition. Perfect competition, monopolistic competition are the 2 listed on the slide. Perfect competition exists when there are many sellers in a market and none is large enough to dictate the price of the product. Sellers' products are typically identical or very similar, such as agricultural products like apples or corns or potatoes. Under a monopolistic competition, a large number of sellers produce very similar products that buyers perceive as different, like hot dogs, sodas, laptops, etc. Through advertising and branding and packaging, sellers try to convince buyers that their products are different from competitors, though they may be very similar or even interchangeable. The 3rd degree of competition is called oligopoly. It's a degree of competition in which just a few sellers dominate a market, like tobacco or gasoline, automobiles, etc. One reason some industries remain in the hands of a few sellers is that the initial investment required to enter the business is often tremendous. For example, think about how it would cost to start a new airplane manufacturing facility. The fourth and final degree of competition is called a monopoly. A monopoly occurs when one seller controls the total supply of a product or service and sets the price. In the United States, laws prohibit creation of monopolies. Nonetheless, the U.S. Legal system has permitted monopolies in the market for public entities that sell natural gas, water, or electric power. To understand how free market capitalism works, you have to understand the benefits and limitations of free markets. One benefit of the free market is that it allows open competition among companies. Businesses must provide customers with high quality products at fair prices with good service. If they don't, they'll lose their customers. Free market capitalism, more than any other economic system, provides opportunities for poor people to work their way out of poverty. Capitalism also encourages businesses to be more efficient so they can successfully compete on price and quality. Even as free market capitalism has brought prosperity to the United States and to much of the rest of the world, it has brought inequality as well. Business owners and managers usually make more money and have more wealth than lower level workers. Yet people who are older, disabled, or sick may not be able to start and manage a business, and others may not have the talent or the drive. Unfortunately, one of the dangers of free markets is that some people let greed dictate how they act. Criminals and ethic charges brought against some of the big businesses in banking, accounting, telecommunications, and even pharmaceutical companies indicate the scope of this problem. In order to meet the government's needs, individuals have to pay taxes all around the world. As you can see from this slide, Belgium has the highest tax rates. To explain this difference, think about the differences between capitalism and socialism. Socialism believes that the government should provide increased services for people, redistributing income from the richer people to the poorer. Therefore, you have to pay more taxes to support those benefits. Some of the major disadvantages of socialism is reduced incentive to work harder because it results in less innovation. Marginal tax rates are higher and can sometimes approach 85% after a person reaches a certain amount of income. So if you think about it, 85 cents for each dollar you earn and pay taxes when you get to that higher level of earnings. So the book talks about brain drain, and the brain drain refers to that loss of professional trained individuals due to all those higher taxes. Let's review. In free market capitalism, there are 4 basic rights. They are the right to own private property, the right to own a business and keep the business's profits, the right of freedom of choice, and the right of freedom of competition. Decisions about what to produce and in what quantity are decided by the market, to where consumers send signals about what to make, how many, and the color, etc. Prices are determined by economic concepts like supply and demand. And the 4 degrees of competition are perfect competition, which is, for instance, a farmer's market where goods are indistinguishable. Today, however, there are no good examples of perfect competition. Monopolistic competition, such as fast food restaurants where products are similar but consumers perceive the products to be different. Product differentiation is key here when marketing. Oligopoly, a situation where just a few major producers dominate the market, like for products of tobacco, gasoline, and automobiles, but only a few sellers really dominate because the initial investment to enter such a market is just so significant. A monopoly is a situation where only one producer exists in a market and U.S. law typically prohibits monopolies. To fully understand socialism, we need to think about the benefits of socialism. The major benefits is supposed to be social equality. Ideally, it comes about because the government takes income from wealthier people in the form of taxes and redistributes it to poorer people through various government programs like free education, free healthcare, childcare, longer vacations, shorter work weeks, and then a generous sick leave. To fully understand socialism, we must think about the negative consequences. Since socialism promises to create more equality than capitalism, it takes away from some of the business people's incentives to do business. For example, when a socialist became a president of France, the top tax rate reached as high as 75%, with many of the citizens paying over 70%, which caused innovators and creative thinkers like doctors, lawyers, business owners, and others that learned a lot of money to leave France and find a place where they could live in a more capitalist society. When this happens, it's called the loss of the best and the brightest people to other countries, which is also known as brain drain. So when this happens, when these best and brightest people leave the country, it leaves for fewer inventions and innovations that reward capitalistic countries instead of that socialism country. Communism is an economic and political system in which the government makes almost all economic decisions and owns almost all the major factors of production. One problem with communism is that the government has no way of knowing what to produce because prices don't reflect supply and demand as they do in free markets. The government must guess what the people need. As a result, there's shortages of many items like food and clothing. Communism doesn't inspire business people to work hard because there's no incentives. Communist countries such as North Korea and Cuba are suffering as a result due to the severe economic depression. The nations of the world have largely been divided between those that followed the concepts of capitalism and those that follow concepts of communism or socialism. Free market economies exist when the market largely determines what goods and services can be produced, who gets them, and how the economy grows. Capitalism is the popular term for this economic system. Command economies exist when the government largely decides what goods and services will be produced and who gets them, and how the economy will grow. This is socialism and communism are variations of this system. Although all countries actually have some mix of both systems, neither free market nor command economies have resulted in optimal economic conditions. Neither the free market or command economies have really resulted in sound economic conditions, which is why there's that trend towards the mixed economies. The mixed economic systems is where some of the resources are allocated by the market and some are through the government. Let's review. Socialists believe that wealth should be more evenly distributed than in free market capitalism. Government should be empowered to carry out the distribution of wealth. Free education from college, free health care, free childcare, and some benefits of socialism. The key drawback of socialism is higher taxes, often causing that brain drain in the economy where those high thinkers leave to go to a different country. Socialism is also tends to inspire less innovation because of that brain drain and those smart people leaving the country. They don't have as much innovation because they're losing the people that normally would make that innovation. Most nations have drifted away from communism, but there's still North Korea and Cuba that run based on communism. Russia, Vietnam, and China still have some communist practices in place. Mixed economies have systems where the allocation of resource is made by the market and some by the government. Like most nations of the world, the United States is a mixed economy. To understand the U.S. economic system, we have to understand the key economic indicators. First, the gross domestic product, or known as GDP. The GDP is the total value of final goods and services produced in a country in a given year. Both domestic and foreign-owned companies can produce the goods and services including in that GDP as long as companies are located within the country's boundaries. For example, production values from a Japanese automaker like Honda in a factory in Ohio will be included in the U.S.'s GDP. Revenue generated by Ford's factory in Mexico is included in Mexico's GDP, even though Ford is a U.S. company. Gross output, or GO, is a measure of total sales volume at all stages of production. GO is almost twice the size of GDP and is considered a better indicator of the business cycle and more consistent with economic growth theory. It shows that the consumer spending is the effect, not the cause of prosperity. This slide shows in 2019, the U.S. gross domestic product was over $21 trillion. This compares the GDP of $5.8 trillion in 1990 and $2.8 trillion in 1980. As you can see on the slide, the U.S. GDP has grown over 400% since 1980. America is often referred to as the engine that runs the world's economy. It is easy to see that the truth in this statement with the U.S. gross domestic product, or GDP, far exceeds the 4 other countries listed on the slide. While China has grown dramatically since 1975, their economy is still dwarfed by the U.S. Much is made of the economic growth of China, India, Russia, and Brazil, but you must understand that the sum of the 4 countries' GDP is about $0.5 trillion less than the U.S. Brazil's GDP has taken nearly $1 trillion tumble in recent years. In 2011, their GDP reached at 2.61 trillion. By 2019, it had fallen to 1.84 trillion. The next economic indicator is unemployment rate. While the term unemployment seems simple enough, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a very specific definition. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, unemployment is the percentage of civilians that are at least 16 years old who are unemployed and tried to find a job within the prior 4 weeks. The Bureau of Labor Statistics figure does not include workers who had a part-time job because they couldn't find that full-time work. Those who are underemployed, which means working at jobs far below their qualifications, or those workers who gave up looking for jobs altogether. If that's not confusing enough, there are 4 types of unemployment which students are often surprised to discover, which we'll talk about in future slides. The U.S. unemployment rate reached its lowest point in 30 years at 3.9% in 2000. By 2010, however, it rose to over 10%. In 2011, started to hover around 9%. As you can see from this slide that shows the unemployment rates from 1989 to 2020, the unemployment rate in the U.S. over the last 50 years has been as low as 3.9%, but just recently in 2020, it rose past 10%. The 4 types of unemployment are fictional unemployment, which refers to those people that quit work because they didn't like their job, their boss, or the working conditions, and those people haven't found jobs yet. Structural unemployment refers to unemployment caused by restructuring of firms or by mismatch between skills of job seekers and the requirements of available jobs. Cyclical unemployment occurs when a recession or a similar economic downturn in the business cycle happens. This type of unemployment is the most serious. And then the 4th one is seasonal unemployment, which means that it occurs when the demand for labor varies over the year, like for harvesting crops, or you might see this during the holiday season, Black Friday going all the way through Christmas. Something to keep in mind when you're looking for a job are some of the best and worst cities for a job search. According to the text, Scottsdale, Arizona, South Burlington, Vermont, San Francisco and Fremont, California, and Austin, Texas are the best places for a job search. The worst places are Brownsville, Texas, Stockton, California, Newark, New Jersey, Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Detroit, Michigan. Other key economic indicators are inflation and price index. Inflation is just a general rise of prices of goods and services over time. So we're seeing that now in our economy where the price of groceries is growing exponentially. And I think the last I heard, inflation was at about 9% this year, which is really high. Another indicator is disinflation, which that's when the price increases are slowing. Deflation, a situation in which prices are declining. And then lastly, stagflation. It's the economy is slowing, but the prices of goods and services are going up anyway. One other term that's not listed on this slide is called hyperinflation. So this is when inflation is out of control, where price of goods and services rise at an annual rate of 1,000% or more, which I don't believe we're in any of that kind of danger, at least not yet. But just an example of where hyperinflation may have affected a country historically is Germany after World War I. They suffered severe economic and political shock, which resulted in large part from the terms of the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war. The damage by the war, it was just victorious. And the treaty required Germans to make payments or reparations in order to, you know, make up for what they did to, the world in general. So if you're interested in that, you might want to take a look at that. Investopedia has a couple good examples. So there's Germany, Zimbabwe, and Hungary, all areas that suffered from hyperinflation. And the last slide, we were just talking about hyperinflation. And again, this is a situation where inflation can rise in excess of 1,000%. And in this particular case, it's showing where hyperinflation rose by 50% a month. In Venezuela, the inflation rate went from 63% in 2014 to 481% in 2016. So that's just an example on how quick. That's in 2 years. The currency, which is called the bolivar, was so low that cash to pay for goods and services was being weighed instead of counted. So think about having these stacks of cash that at one time may have been worth thousands of dollars, but it was diminished by inflation, and they started weighing it. In the U.S., the Federal Reserve does maintain our supply of money, and they set their interest rates so that they keep inflation under control. And again, we're seeing right now in our economy where they have just recently increased our rates, and I think they're over 6% now, maybe higher, for just a mortgage loan, to where just back in January when I refinanced my house, I had a rate of 3.25. And the reason the Federal Reserve is doing this is because spending has been so out of control that it caused inflation for the price of goods and services to go up so high. So what they're trying to do is make it better for our economy, so all the consumers are not being affected as bad. From all the chatter I've heard, it could be into 23 or 24 before we even see how this interest rate increase helps our economy. Let's hope that's not the case, though. As you can probably appreciate, the importance of monitoring the nation's inflation rate, because we don't want it to spiral out of control. As inflation is increasing, it acts as a hidden tax increase, eroding the purchasing power of the population. So moving on with other key economic indicators, let's talk about the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. This consists of the statistics that measure the pace of inflation or deflation. The government can compute the cost of goods and the services, including housing, food, apparel, or even medical care, to see whether or not they are going up or down. The government today is relying more on the measure of core inflation, which is the CPI minus foods and energy costs. Since the cost of food and energy can have temporary price shocks, the inflation measures reported core inflation are actually lower than real costs. Since the CPI is important to you, think of your wages, your rent, your leases, or even governmental benefits that's based on the information that the CPI generates. Next, let's talk about the Producer Price Index, or PPI. The PPI measures the change in prices at the wholesale level. The wholesale level is basically where a company might go and buy a product at a lower cost in order to resell it at a higher price. The PPI tracks price changes in all industries, almost all industries anyway, in the goods producing sectors of the U.S. And if you're interested to hear more about these types of indicators, you could pick up business periodicals, or you can even listen to podcasts just by searching on the internet for consumer price indexes or producer price indexes. Another way of understanding some of the key economic indicators is understanding how productivity in the U.S. Affects the economic system. One problem with the service industry is that there's an influx of machinery and technology. May add to the quality of service provided, but it doesn't always increase the amount of work somebody puts out. When you add technology, it definitely makes production faster and easier. Some of the downturns to this would be how high productivity with computers and robots can lead to high unemployment. But there's something to be said for an actual person doing certain types of work. So for instance, at some car manufacturing companies, they don't necessarily use robots for all of the different parts of building a car, because there's some things that are like fine details that robots just can't do. So there's a lot of argument out there. If you cared to look it up, you might search on, can robots replace people? So there's a lot of interesting theories behind it. But in essence, yeah, they can increase high productivity, but there's just some things that robots can't do. Let's continue to talk about productivity in the service sector when it comes to the economic systems. So as we talked in the last slide, how when we add new technology, it adds to the quality of the services, but not necessarily increasing the worker's output. A new form of measurement has to be created in order to account for quality as well as quantity of the output. As you can see from the illustration on the slide, I think it's kind of cool to see how the process, how you go through, having your laptop out, and you have the magnifying glass that helps you really dig into the details, because you might be surfing on the internet. A light bulb might then go off in your mind thinking, aha, I've got the answer. And then you're able to present that information to an executive or your boss. And then it spurs more information and discussions. And then, eventually having that ability, there's that icon for the wireless to be able to transmit that information out to others once you've solved that problem that you're trying to get better quality out of the work. So, just kind of think it through and maybe even search on the internet to look how you could measure productivity in the service sector, or just even in the manufacturing sector as well. So again, thinking about key economic indicators, let's talk about the business cycles. And as it says on the slides, the business cycles are really just the periodic rises and falls that occur in the economies over time. Economists look at a number of business cycles, from seasonal cycles that occur within a year, and then also cycles that could be 48 to 60 months, which is 4 or 5 years. The 4 phases of long-term business cycles is an economic boom. Basically, when business is booming, I'm sure you've heard that term before. The next cycle is a recession, when 2 or more consecutive quarters of decline in the GDP, or the gross domestic product. Then we go through a depression, a severe recession, which is accompanied by deflation. And then the last part of the phase is recovery, when the economy starts to stabilize and they grow and eventually start having that economic boom again. Something to think about is, even though it is true that a recession is 2 or more consecutive quarters of contracting GDP, but for a recession to be officially labeled a recession, It has to be declared by the National Bureau of Economic Research. The website is www.nber.org, which is on the PowerPoint slide. It provides lots of resources to explain the different parts of the business cycle, but as you might be hearing on the news, on the internet, on social media about recession, that the US is in a recession or the world in general is in a recession, just start, listening to some of those comments that they talk about regarding a recession. They might be saying it, but has that National Bureau of Economic Research actually declared it yet? So interesting to know, or to even look up and see if we're even there yet. So we might still be kind of teetering in between economic boom and recession. Let's continue to talk about the economic system, and then also how we stabilize the economy through the fiscal policy. And when we say fiscal, it's not physical, it's fiscal. It sounds very similar. The difference is fiscal actually means dealing with money or budget dollars that the government or a nonprofit has in order to operate from. So in this case, for the U.S. economic system, it's the federal government's efforts to keep the economy stable by increasing or decreasing taxes or even government spending. There is a Keynesian economic theory that says that a government policy of increasing spending and taxes or cutting taxes could stimulate the economy in a recession. So makes me wonder if this theory is going to be put to the test with the way the U.S. is experiencing the rapid inflation that it's going through right now, as we teeter between booming business and a potential recession. The tools to set fiscal policy is, again, taxation and government spending. Keep in mind, in the U.S., the percentage of the gross domestic product the government takes through taxes at all levels varies. When you count all fees, sales taxes, state taxes, and more taxes on the highest earning U.S. citizens, it could exceed as much as 50%. So think about that when you think about how these millionaires, how they earn all this money and what the potential taxes they could have to pay, just depending on the situation. The U.S. economic system stabilizes the economy through fiscal policy. The national deficit is the amount of money the federal government spends beyond what it collects in taxes for any given year. The national debt is the sum of government deficits over time. The national debt is now around 26 trillion, at least at the time that the textbook was written. If the government takes in more revenue that it spends, then that results in a national surplus, which we haven't seen in quite some time, and we're probably pretty far away from even balancing our budget based on where we are right now. On the graph on the screen, it shows the national deficit at the beginning of 1980, which was around the $1 trillion mark. And over the years, how it's just continually risen, but it's had quite a spike around 2010 and has just continued to rise over time, where we are in 2020, which is the time the book was written or the data was retrieved at that 26 trillion. So you can see where there were attempts to try to keep spending under control, but just in the 2010s, it just started going crazy. Some of this can be attributed to more social spending that we might have seen from different political parties to where some are more socialist and other are more conservative, like the Republicans. So it would be interesting to see if where these skyrocketed debt amount starts, who was actually in office at the time. And I think there was a Democrat in office at the time when it started spiking. But something can be said for prior to that time where there was a Republican in office. So that would have been '01 probably through '07. There was a Republican in office. So you can see where it kind of starts to increase even under the Republican rule, but even more so. And it's not necessarily just because of a particular political party. It could be because of conflict that the U.S. is dealing with overseas. So it's just really interesting to see all of this data come out. I'm sure you all have heard about the nation's debt. According to the book, it says that the national debt has reached over $25 trillion. So, according to this slide, if we stacked $1 bills of this $25 trillion, that debt would stretch 1.5 million miles, and the moon is only 238 or so thousand miles away. If you're interested, you can check out the amount of the national debt by going to the webpage below. But think about how this debt affects our economy. The national debt itself continues to increase by $2.4 billion a day. On a per person basis, that would be each citizen's share of the debt is over $76,000, which means a family of four shares the debt burden of $305,000. That's a lot to think about. At the time that I recorded this slide and I went to the website, the U.S. national debt was at that $30 trillion. So as you can see, the amount on this slide had already been outdated by the time a few minutes later when I went to the website. So here's another interesting slide just to put things in perspective of thinking about how much money can actually buy as far as product. So as you can see on the screen, we're talking about initially $1 million. If we were thinking in terms of Egg McMuffins and a large coffee for the president and the U.S. Secret Service, it would be able to buy members every day an Egg McMuffin and a large coffee for almost 4 months. But next, let's look at $1 billion, where Egg McMuffin and large coffee could be bought for all of them for 308 years. And then moving forward to $1 trillion, it allows the purchase of the Egg McMuffin and coffee for 307,681 years. So just by pure contrast on the different levels of dollars on what it can buy. Very interesting to put it in perspective if you've never thought of it in that way. So let's talk monetary policy. Monetary policy is used to keep the economy growing. Monetary policy and the role is controlled by the Fed in a way to keep the economy at the right pace. Monetary policy is the management of money supply and interest rates by the Federal Reserve Bank. And we've talked about before how interest rates lower and increase based on where the economy is. So again, when the economy is booming and inflation is out of control, the Fed's going to raise interest rates in order to make it more expensive to borrow money. So that way, people borrow less and it slows the economy. Just the opposite, when the Fed sets more policies and lowers interest rates, this helps get the economy booming again in order to, it's cheaper to borrow money with the lower interest rates. So businesses and people tend to spend more money, which helps it grow. The Fed also controls the money supply. A simple explanation of this function is that the more money the Fed makes available to business people, the faster the economy is supposed to grow. Let's review. The three key economic indicators are the gross domestic product, or also known as GDP, the unemployment rate, and the price indexers. The U.S. GDP is approximately $20 trillion. Our high GDP allows citizens to enjoy a high standard of living. The U.S. unemployment reached as low as 3.5 in the early 2020, but soared to over 14% by mid-2020 due to the pandemic. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, has not risen to high levels, keeping inflation in check. However, the recession has caused fears of deflation. A recession, or 2 or more consecutive quarters of decline in the GDP. A depression is a severe recession, usually accompanied by deflation. Fiscal policy refers to the government's efforts to keep the economy stable by increasing or decreasing taxes or government spending. Monetary policy is the management of the nation's money supply and interest rates. The Federal Reserve controls the money supply in the United States. And just recently, in order to keep inflation under control, the Federal Reserve has different ways of trying to fix that. And one of the most recent ways that they did that is by increasing interest rates in order to control spending, in the hopes that inflation would either stabilize or go down. So that's a to be determined thing that we'll see throughout the year.